In 10 years, the hospital you are currently walking into every morning might not employ a single doctor.
Right.
It might not even have an emergency department. I mean, the massive monolithic building where you have spent your entire clinical career is actively being dismantled by invisible economic forces. And honestly, most of us are too busy managing the immediate chaos of the wards to even notice it happening.
Well, the irony there is that as clinicians, we are rigorously trained to eliminate blind spots.
Exactly.
We demand high-resolution imaging, we want comprehensive blood panels, we insist on multidisciplinary team reviews before we make a single clinical decision. Yet, when it comes to the structural future of the institutions we actually work inside, we tolerate a complete lack of visibility. We sort of just operate with the strategic blindfold on.
That contrast is exactly what we're stripping down today on this deep dive, because usually when we discuss clinical practice, the expectation is profound precision.
Right.
A patient presents in the fracture clinic, the radiograph appears on the screen, and the pathology is categorical. You see a displaced transverse fracture of the tibial shaft. The intervention pathway is binary, it is immediate, and that clarity is deeply comforting.
It is very safe.
But the moment you take off the scrubs and walk into a department strategy session or a clinical directorate meeting, that high-resolution clarity just vanishes. You are suddenly navigating a murky, entirely reactive environment.
Yeah, and the reality for the clinical directors, the senior consultants, and the healthcare leaders listening to this is that institutional strategy is entirely trapped.
Trapped by what exactly?
By the calendar. It is suffocated by a compressed, highly reactive 12-month loop that is governed purely by annual budgets, winter pressures, and, waiting list initiatives.
The constant firefighting.
Precisely.
Yeah.
When your horizon is dictated by the next quarter's throughput targets, long-range structural thinking feels like an academic luxury. But I assure you it isn't.
No, because the landscape changes regardless.
Right. The structural shifts in healthcare delivery do not announce themselves. They arise suddenly. And when an institution is caught off guard, the response is inevitably panicked, it is reactive, and it is staggeringly expensive.
So today we are tearing up that 12-month budget cycle. We are forcing a completely different vantage point. We are going to look at the economic, demographic, and technological pressures that are actively warping the healthcare landscape right now, and we are going to project them forward to see where they logically conclude.
Which is a fascinating exercise.
It really is. We are exploring 5 distinct, highly plausible architectural models for the hospital of the future. And I want to be clear, the objective here isn't to play clairvoyant. We aren't predicting the future. The objective is to understand the mechanics of these shifting models so that you can navigate the terrain, protect your clinical department, and strategically position your own career before the ground moves beneath you.
And to understand how this dismantling happens, we actually have to look at the foundational economics keeping the current monolithic structures intact today.
The traditional hospital.
Right, the traditional hospital, the massive campus that attempts to do absolutely everything for everyone. That is a product of a specific historical era.
Built on aggregation.
Exactly. It was built on a model of aggregation to capture economies of scale. You put the massive imaging suites, the complex pathology labs, the intensive care units, and the outpatient clinics under one massive roof.
Because it made sense at the time.
It did. But the financial viability of that model relies on a very delicate mechanism, which is cross-subsidization.
Let's break down that mechanism for a moment, because it is essentially the linchpin of the entire system.
It is the only way the maths works.
Right. In a legacy hospital, the highly predictable, high-margin elective procedures, let's look at orthopedics. Your routine primary hip and knee arthroplasties are essentially bankrolling the massive loss-leading departments.
Absolutely.
The elective orthopedic list subsidizes the 24/7 trauma rotas, the emergency department, and the intensive care unit.
Which is precisely the opposite of what the public assumes.
They think A&E is the moneymaker.
Right. But it is the absolute financial reality that A&E is a massive cost center.
Yeah.
But here's the structural shift. Those high-margin, low-acuity cases are no longer captive to the main hospital.
They are leaving the building.
Exactly. We are seeing a relentless drive toward unbundling. This is the first scenario. Routine services, day case surgeries, advanced diagnostic imaging, and urgent care are being systematically extracted from the central campus.
And relocated where?
To distributed, highly efficient sites closer to where patients actually live. Independent surgical hubs, suburban diagnostic centers, that sort of thing.
I look at that unbundling trend and I see the collapse of that cross-subsidization model. If independent ambulatory surgery centers or suburban elective hubs siphon off the healthy, lucrative patients who just require routine procedures, the mothership basically bleeds out.
It is a financial hemorrhage.
Right. The central hospital is left holding the bag. It retains the sickest, most complex patients with massive overhead costs, but without the reliable margin of the elective lists to actually keep the lights on.
Which means the monolithic hospital becomes economically unsustainable.
Completely.
I mean, maintaining a massive brutalist infrastructure with comprehensive critical care capabilities just to perform routine day case procedures is fundamentally inefficient.
It is overkill.
It is absolute overkill. Under modern value-based care contracts and bundled payment models, doing an elective knee arthroscopy in a tertiary center where you have intensive care units and neurosurgical rotas factored into the overhead calculation that destroys your margin.
Because the fixed costs are astronomical.
Right, but moving that exact same procedure to a fit-for-purpose, high-throughput day surgery unit protects the margin.
So the shift from protecting volume to protecting margin changes the entire metric of success for a trust.
It changes everything.
Historically, hospital leadership fought to keep every possible patient coming through the main doors just to justify the fixed costs of the building.
Keep the beds full.
Exactly. Now, the imperative is to keep the lower acuity patients out of the expensive building. But I want to examine the cultural friction this creates for us.
The human element.
Right, because clinicians heavily map their professional identity to geography. A senior consultant has spent 2 decades walking through the same main entrance, holding court in the same doctor's mess, conducting ward rounds in the same sprawling building.
That is their fiefdom.
It is. So if their practice is abruptly unbundled to a slick, hyper-efficient surgical hub on an industrial estate 20 miles away, the institutional identity shatters.
Well, the cultural dislocation is severe, and it's often fiercely resisted by senior medical staff. We are moving away from the era of the single-site clinical fiefdom.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
Very tough. The clinicians who thrive in an unbundled ecosystem are those who decouple their professional identity from a specific postcode.
What does that look like in practice?
They build adaptable careers. They operate across multiple distributed sites. They manage clinical teams remotely, and they potentially hold contracts with multiple entities. The rigidity of demanding your own dedicated theater in the main hospital every Tuesday morning, that is a vulnerability now, not a strength, in this model.
But unbundling creates a massive vacuum. I mean, if all the routine, highly predictable care leaves the main campus, the central hospital cannot simply continue operating as a hollowed-out version of its former self.
No, we would go bankrupt.
Right. To survive the loss of that elective income, the mothership has to fundamentally alter its clinical DNA. It has to double down on the extreme cases it previously managed alongside the routine care.
Which leads us to the second scenario.
Exactly. It has to transform into a high-acuity fortress.
And the fortress model represents a complete inversion of traditional hospital economics.
How so?
Well, if you lose the volume of routine cases, your only survival strategy is to pivot entirely to profound specialty depth. The remaining central hospital narrows its scope, but it radically deepens its capabilities.
It becomes highly specialized.
Yes, it becomes the ultimate, undeniable destination for cases that are simply too sick, too complicated, or too rare to be managed in any distributed community site.
We're talking about major polytrauma.
Major polytrauma, severe spinal deformities, complex pelvic reconstructions, multi-organ failure. The sort of things that require 4 different surgical specialties in the room at the same time.
The required capital expenditure for that kind of transformation must be astronomical.
It is eye-watering.
Because you are no longer investing in high-throughput day wards. You are pouring capital into intraoperative MRI suites, advanced robotic capabilities, and massive expansions of critical care capacity.
Right, you're explicitly trading high patient volume for high clinical margins and elite institutional reputation.
But there is a catch. The investment in top-tier clinical talent and technology is staggering, but the entire fortress model contains a fatal economic vulnerability.
The moat.
Exactly. The literature on healthcare foresight frameworks consistently highlights a specific concept. The fortress is only a fortress if the moat is intact. Let's define this moat in a modern operational context, because we aren't building physical barriers.
No, it is a strategic barrier.
Right. In a clinical landscape where elective care has been unbundled to the suburbs, what actually secures the perimeter of a quaternary referral center?
The moat is the referral network.
Okay, unpack that.
A high-acuity fortress absolutely depends on a steady, uninterrupted supply of complex cases to justify its massive fixed costs. You cannot run a financially viable, severe trauma and complex reconstruction center if you are not actually receiving the complex referrals.
Because the robots are just sitting idle?
Exactly. The robotic suites are empty, the highly paid subspecialists are drinking coffee in the mess. The fortress requires ironclad, legally and economically integrated relationships with the very distributed sites that are handling the lower acuity care.
Which creates a fascinating paradox.
It really does.
I mean, the central hospital physically distances itself from the community hubs by unbundling services, but simultaneously, it must bind itself to them tighter than ever through data sharing agreements, shared electronic health records, and clinical governance protocols.
It has to have its tentacles everywhere.
Right, because if an independent suburban urgent care center starts referring its complex patients to a rival fortress across the city, your economic model just collapses. You have the robotic theaters and the surgical teams standing by, but the pipeline is dry.
So the integration must be seamless. Your financial lifeblood as a fortress relies on diagnostic pathways happening miles away, completely outside of your direct physical control.
That is a terrifying prospect
Oh.
for traditional hospital administrators.
It is. And this structural reality has massive implications for the clinical workforce inside the central building.
How does it affect the surgeons?
Well, if you are a clinician operating at the very pinnacle of your specialty, pushing the boundaries of surgical intervention and requiring robust multidisciplinary backing to manage immense risk, the fortress is your ideal environment.
Because you have all the toys.
You have all the toys, you have the ICU backup, and you are insulated from the churn of routine care.
I see a major casualty in this transition, though. Consider the brilliant generalist.
Yeah.
You know, the consultant who handles a wide variety of mid-acuity cases exceptionally well, but doesn't necessarily subspecialize in ultra-rare, high-risk pathologies. What happens to them when the building around them transforms into a fortress?
They become strategically stranded.
That is a great phrase. Strategically stranded.
Because the daily work they excel at the routine procedures, the standard fracture management, it just no longer fits the high-margin, complex care business model of the institution.
It is essentially low-value work for that specific building.
Exactly. Leadership will begin to view their theater time as an inefficient use of a highly specialized asset. They will find themselves under-resourced, deprioritizing capital allocation, and eventually squeezed out to the distributed networks. The generalists simply cannot survive inside the fortress.
That is a stark reality for a lot of people listening, but both the unbundled network and the high acuity fortress still operate on one deeply entrenched assumption,
Which is?
that the hospital is the primary employer, the central organizing body, and the ultimate provider of clinical care. So let's completely remove that assumption.
Okay.
What if the hospital decides it no longer wants to manage the sheer chaos of employing thousands of clinicians and bearing the direct risk of care delivery? What if it just wants to provide the building and the regulatory framework?
Which leads us to the third scenario.
Exactly. This leads to a highly disruptive concept, the platform hospital.
And this model represents a profound uncoupling of infrastructure from clinical delivery.
It changes what a hospital fundamentally is.
Absolutely. In the platform model, the institution essentially operates like an aviation authority managing a major international airport.
I love this analogy. Walk us through it.
The hospital provides the highly regulated physical infrastructure. The theaters, the intensive care wards, the imaging suites. It builds the digital backbone and enforces the overarching clinical governance and safety protocols. But it stops employing the majority of the medical staff.
So who employs the surgeons?
Nobody. Or rather, they employ themselves. The hospital leases its infrastructure to multiple independent clinical groups, private practices, and innovative care startups.
The airport metaphor perfectly illustrates the mechanics of this. Because the airport authority doesn't fly the planes,
No.
it doesn't employ the pilots, and it doesn't sell the tickets. It owns the runways, it manages air traffic control for safety, and it charges the airlines a premium for gate access and landing rights.
Right. And in this scenario, the hospital is the airport.
And the independent orthopedic surgical groups are the airlines competing on the departure board?
Precisely. The hospital makes its margin on infrastructure utilization, leasing fees, and governance oversight.
So it completely insulates itself from the variable margins of individual clinical encounters.
The economic appeal for the infrastructure owner is massive. I mean, they divest the immense human resources burden, the pension liabilities, and the constant friction of clinical management.
It sounds like the WeWork of healthcare.
It is exactly that. We are already seeing private equity-backed entities attempting to build this, providing turnkey, fully equipped clinical spaces for entrepreneurial medical groups. However, the friction point in this model is colossal.
I was going to say, there has to be a cap.
It fundamentally disrupts the traditional concept of clinical accountability.
Right. I see a glaring liability issue here. A delayed flight is an inconvenience. A severe postoperative infection following a complex revision arthroplasty on a shared platform is a medical legal catastrophe.
Yes, it is.
When a catastrophic error occurs, who is actually accountable? I mean, where does the buck start when the primary surgeon works for an independent limited liability partnership, the scrub nurse is an independent contractor hired by the platform, the anesthetist is a freelancer, and the postoperative physiotherapy is managed by a third-party digital startup?
It is a mess.
Yeah.
You have identified the fatal weakness of the platform model, the extreme diffusion of clinical risk.
Because everyone points the finger at someone else.
Exactly. The platform attempts to neatly separate infrastructure provision from clinical delivery, but medical law, vicarious liability, and patient expectations rarely tolerate such sterile divisions.
That a lawyer certainly don't.
No, they don't. If a patient suffers harm, the litigation will invariably target the deepest pockets.
Which is usually the platform owner.
Right, regardless of the employment status of the surgeon. The legal framework surrounding credentialing, indemnity, and corporate negligence would require radical restructuring to make a pure platform model viable at scale.
Assuming those legal frameworks adapt over the next decade, which they might think, the skill set required for a medical professional to survive in a platform hospital changes beyond recognition.
Completely.
You can no longer rely on climbing a linear, traditional hospital hierarchy. The skills that make you an excellent ward manager do not translate to this environment.
No, the required competency shifts from institutional compliance to fierce entrepreneurialism.
Which is not taught in medical school.
Not at all. The clinicians who thrive here are those capable of forming their own agile clinical groups, negotiating ruthless service-level agreements for theater space, managing their own supply chains, and marketing their outcomes directly.
So you have to be a businessman as well as a surgeon.
Yes. If you require a monolithic employer to dictate your workflow, manage your clinical team, and guarantee your salary, the platform ecosystem will be incredibly hostile. You are no longer just a clinical leader. You are essentially the chief executive of your own micro-enterprise.
Which means these independent clinical micro-enterprises are now operating under the same roof, fiercely competing with one another for theater access.
Then ultimately competing for the patient.
Right. The dynamic shifts from a captive patient population assigned by a central triage system to a highly fluid market.
And this forces a transition into a model that many clinicians actively despise.
Scenario 4. The consumer-facing hospital.
Yes. The consumerization of healthcare is a relentless structural force. Regardless of whether an institution operates as a fortress, an unbundled network, or a platform, the power dynamic is irrevocably shifting toward the patient as an active consumer.
They are shopping for care.
They are. Hospitals are being forced to act like leading service industries in the broader economy.
Now, I need to clarify what we mean by consumerization because it is often trivialized in the medical community.
It is seen as a marketing buzzword.
Exactly. We are not just talking about putting a coffee shop in the lobby or having a modern website with a nice font.
Oh.
We're talking about the deep integration of consumer-grade digital architecture with monolithic electronic health records. It means API interoperability that allows a patient to book a specialist appointment instantly via an app, view their diagnostic imaging in real time, and receive absolute price transparency regarding their out-of-pocket costs before they ever consent to surgery.
Because the benchmark for consumer experience is no longer the hospital down the road.
What is the benchmark?
The benchmark is retail banking. It is aviation. It is digital logistics.
Amazon.
Exactly. Patients can track a low-value retail package to the exact minute it arrives at their front door. Yet, they routinely sit in hospital waiting rooms for 4 hours past their scheduled appointment time without a single digital update or explanation.
The disparity is actually embarrassing.
It is. The gap between consumer expectation and healthcare delivery is widening into a chasm.
This is where we hit a massive wall of clinical arrogance.
Oh, we do.
Many senior consultants listening will hear the phrase patient experience and immediately dismiss it as administrative fluff. The internal monologue is very predictable.
I am a world-class reconstructive surgeon.
Right. My clinical outcomes are objectively excellent. My complication rates are in the bottom percentile. Why should I care if the patient found the parking difficult or the booking software clunky? They are here for my surgical competence, not a hospitality experience.
Well, that mindset is increasingly dangerous,
Yeah.
and the data actively refutes it.
Let's talk about the data.
Look at patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs. These are the very metrics increasingly tied to reimbursement and value-based care contracts. They do not cleanly separate the surgical intervention from the administrative pathway.
The patient experiences it as one single event.
Exactly. The psychological stress of navigating a labyrinthine booking system, the anxiety of delayed communication, and the frustration of opaque billing directly impact the patient's perception of their clinical outcome.
So a great surgery can be ruined by a terrible front desk.
Yes, in a consumer-facing model, clinical excellence is no longer the primary differentiator. It is simply the baseline expectation.
So surgical competence gets you into the market, but the logistical and communicative experience is what captures the market share.
That is the reality.
If an agile new entrant provides the exact same clinical outcome but wraps it in a seamless, digitally transparent, highly communicative pathway, the arrogant clinician bleeds market share.
They will lose their patients.
The patient will simply refuse to tolerate the friction, regardless of the surgeon's pedigree.
The clinicians who win in this scenario are those who flatly refuse to separate clinical excellence from a superior patient experience.
They see it as one holistic pathway.
Right. They view the digital interface, the ease of access, and the clarity of communication as integral components of the clinical pathway, not administrative burdens.
And the losers?
The clinicians who stubbornly treat patient experience as someone else's problem will find their waiting lists evaporating. In a consumer-driven market, if the patient does not trust the administrative process, they will never reach your operating table.
So we have mapped out unbundled networks. We have high-tech quaternary fortresses, entrepreneurial platforms, and hyper-digital consumer hubs.
It is a lot of disruption.
It is. It all sounds incredibly disruptive, highly capital-intensive, and honestly exhausting.
Yeah.
But we need to look at the reality for the vast majority of institutions that do not have the capital or the market position to attempt these radical transformations.
The ones just try to keep the lights on.
Right. This brings us to a scenario that lacks the sci-fi gloss, but is arguably the most vital. Scenario 5. The resilient regional hospital.
This is the most pragmatic and critically important scenario we can discuss today.
Who does this apply to?
We're talking about the traditional district general hospitals, the community providers serving mid-sized markets and rural populations.
The backbone of the system.
Absolutely. In this scenario, the hospital does not undergo a dramatic architectural or digital metamorphosis.
Oh.
It doesn't transform into an elite fortress or a digital platform. It simply becomes harder, smarter, and significantly more resilient.
So the building looks the same.
On the surface, the physical footprint looks much like it does today, but the underlying operational engine is entirely restructured to survive economic pressures that would absolutely break a contemporary institution.
It's the relentless pursuit of unglamorous optimization. We are talking about the forensic reduction of clinical variance. Let's look at orthopedics again. If you have two surgeons in the same department performing the exact same elective procedure, but surgeon A routinely uses an implant that costs 3 times as much as surgeon B, with zero statistical difference in long-term patient outcomes, that variance is destroying the hospital's margin.
It is financial sabotage.
Right. The resilient regional hospital survives by ruthlessly standardizing clinical pathways and enforcing supply chain discipline.
But that requires a profound lack of ego from both clinical leadership and hospital administration.
It is very hard to enforce.
Extremely hard.
Yeah.
The discipline of resilience means saying no to flashy vanity projects. You do not purchase a multi-million-pound surgical robot purely to put it on a marketing brochure if your theater turnaround times are currently bleeding an hour of productivity between cases.
Because the basics are still broken.
Right. Instead, you invest that capital into a seamless electronic patient record system that eliminates duplicate data entry and saves your junior doctors 2 hours of administrative typing a day. You invest in workflow optimization, not marketing optics.
It also demands a completely different approach to the workforce.
Oh, absolutely.
Relying on massively expensive locum agencies to plug gaps in a broken rota is financially fatal.
It will bankrupt a regional trust in a matter of months.
Exactly. The resilient model requires deep, sustained creativity in human resources, building rotas that actually acknowledge work-life balance to retain staff, aggressively upskilling allied health professionals to work at the top of their license, and fostering genuinely supportive cultures.
Which is incredibly tedious work.
It is. It is the hardest management challenge in the world because doing the basics perfectly at scale every single day is exhausting.
And the clinicians who build durable careers in this environment are masters of operational excellence and team cohesion.
They really embed themselves.
They commit to their communities. The critical danger here is institutional complacency. The institutions that fail in this scenario are the ones that arrogantly assume their historical presence in a community guarantees their future survival.
The ones who refuse to do the hard work.
Right. They refuse to engage in the grueling work of standardization, and they eventually collapse into their own inefficiency.
So, having explored these 5 distinct landscapes, the unbundled networks extracting margin, the fortresses monopolizing complexity, the platforms divesting clinical risk, the consumer hubs prioritizing the digital pathway, and the resilient regional centers grinding out efficiencies, we need to translate this foresight into immediate strategy.
Make it practical.
Exactly. The theory is fascinating, but how does a clinical director use this framework when they walk into an executive board meeting on Monday morning?
Well, the translation from theory to practice relies entirely on pattern recognition. It is vital to acknowledge that none of these 5 scenarios exist in a pure, isolated state.
It won't be that clean.
No, the structural reality of 2035 will be a messy, complex amalgamation of all these forces. It will be heavily influenced by local demographics, national health policy, and the aggressive actions of private market entrants.
So you aren't just picking one path.
Right. The utility of this framework is not in predicting a single winner and betting your department's future on it.
Then what is the value?
The value is in diagnosing the underlying forces when they manifest in your immediate environment. It provides a strategic vocabulary.
Give me an example.
Okay, if you are evaluating a new clinical director role or considering a massive expansion of your department, you don't just look at the allocated budget or the theater sessions. You interrogate the institutional strategy.
You look under the hood.
Exactly. If the hospital is attempting to build a high-acuity fortress in your specialty, you have to look for the moat. Have they secured the regional referral networks? Do they have the data sharing agreements in place to guarantee the influx of complex cases?
And if they don't?
If they are building the robotic theaters but haven't secured the referral pipeline, you are stepping onto a sinking ship.
This brings us to a pervasive pathology in healthcare leadership, a phenomenon we can define as strategic confusion.
I see this everywhere.
It occurs when large institutions, battered by conflicting stakeholder pressures, unknowingly attempt to pursue multiple, entirely contradictory scenarios simultaneously.
Is madness.
We see this constantly. The executive board demands that the hospital becomes an elite, high-margin quaternary care fortress, investing heavily in rare subspecialties.
Right.
But simultaneously, under pressure from local politicians or demographic demands, they demand the hospital capture all the low-acuity, high-volume community care.
Essentially trying to run an unbundled network inside the main campus.
Exactly.
Well, it's a recipe for operational paralysis and immense clinical burnout.
Because the models clash.
The two models require entirely different cost structures. They require fundamentally different organizational cultures and completely opposing clinical workflows. The institution ends up subsidizing the low-margin community work with the high-margin complex work, failing to deliver excellence in either.
And who suffers?
The clinical directors are caught in the crossfire. They are handed contradictory key performance indicators.
Go faster, but do harder cases.
Right. They are instructed to drastically increase throughput and efficiency for routine cases while simultaneously being told to take on highly complex, time-consuming quaternary referrals that destroy any semblance of an efficient schedule.
So the single most clarifying action a clinical leader can take is to force the institution to name its implicit bet.
Yes.
Because these bets are rarely stated explicitly in the mission statement. I mean, the mission statement is usually generic corporate prose.
Excellence in patient care.
Exactly. The truth is buried in the capital expenditure.
Exactly. You follow the capital.
Yeah.
If the institution is purchasing real estate in affluent suburbs and investing in high-throughput day surgery centers, they are implicitly betting on the unbundled model.
And if they are investing in tech?
If they are pouring millions into digital patient portals and interoperable APIs, they are betting on the consumer-facing model. Once you name the implicit bet, you bring it out of the shadows.
You make the invisible visible.
You do. You can then evaluate whether that specific bet actually aligns with the economic and demographic realities of your specific regional market.
Naming the bet cures the confusion. It stops clinical teams from fighting phantom battles.
It saves a lot of wasted energy.
If the institution is moving towards an unbundled model, you don't waste political capital fighting for more clinic space in the congested central hospital. You volunteer to lead the clinical design of the new suburban elective hub.
You lean into the current.
You align your leadership priorities with the structural current rather than exhausting yourself swimming against it.
When the institutional strategy is coherent, the clinical pathways become logical. The resourcing aligns with the objectives, and the daily friction experienced by the medical staff drops significantly. Foresight is ultimately an instrument of protection for your clinical teams.
We have covered massive structural ground today. We have dragged institutional strategy out of the reactive 12-month firefighting loop and examined the forces actively dismantling and rebuilding the clinical landscape over the next decade.
It is a lot to digest.
It is.
Yes.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. When we study the history of medical leadership, the clinicians who consistently navigate systemic upheaval often look, in retrospect, like absolute visionaries.
You look like geniuses.
They do. They appear brilliantly clairvoyant, perfectly anticipating the shifts in funding, technology, and patient behavior. But the reality is far more grounded.
They don't have a crystal ball.
They do not possess a better crystal ball than anyone else. They were simply willing to look up from the immediate operational chaos and stare slightly further down the road than their peers. They tolerated the murky waters of strategic foresight, allowing them to map the terrain, align their departments, and protect their careers with their eyes wide open.
That is the defining characteristic of effective leadership. The future viability of your clinical practice will not be determined by your ability to predict the exact architectural structure of your hospital in 2035.
No.
It will be determined entirely by your preparedness to adapt to the economic and clinical forces that are already visibly shaping it today.
If you found this strategic breakdown valuable for navigating the realities within your own trust or health system, please take a moment to rate Deep Dive Ortho and share this episode with your clinical director or department lead. It is the single best way to help us continue bringing these critical conversations to the surface. Tomorrow, when you walk back into that fracture clinic and that beautifully clear radiograph appears on the screen, appreciate the profound precision of your clinical work. But remember that outside that clinic door, the institutional landscape is violently shifting. Name the implicit bet your hospital is making, secure your referral pathways, and keep looking down the road. Talk soon.